You are watching Grassroots Television, serving the Roaring Fork Valley since 1971.
This is Tomorrow with Alex Beinstein. And this show is underwritten by McDonald's. McDonald's has many locations in the Roaring Fork Valley, including one in the heart of Aspen. Welcome to the second episode of Tomorrow with Alex Beinstein. Before we get to the show, just tell you, if you want to catch any previous interviews, because I now have a radio show at the University of Chicago, you can go to alexbeinstein.com. You can see interviews with Jesse Jackson, Alan Dershowitz, presidential candidates, and much more. So please tune in. And also, if you miss any of these shows, you can catch these shows, the audio, hopefully a video version, on alexbeinstein.com. But welcome to the second show of Tomorrow with Alex Beinstein. Before we get to the show, just to let you know, if you want to catch any radio shows that I've done at college, you can go to alexbeinstein.com. They have many interesting interviews, including people like Jesse Jackson, James Carville, and two presidential candidates. But today, for today's show, we're going to have a show about boxing and American culture. And who better to have than the president of TopRank, one of the biggest promotional companies for boxing, Todd duBoef. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Terrific. So first I'd like to talk about, not that it's the biggest sampling, but myself, friends, pretty big sports fans, pretty big avid sports fans, no real passion for sports, my age, the youth, college, high school students, even people in their early 20s. Do you find this to be the same? If so, why? Or am I just having different type of friends?
No, I think you've hit something very much on the head. I think we're dealing right now with a very niche market across everything, all sports. Right now you have 600 channels, so you can be in urban music videos, you can be a college sports fan, you could just be a wrestling fan and find that. But what we're dealing with right now is colleges do not have any formal boxing program like they do football, baseball, basketball, and even volleyball and other extensive things. The boxing programs are on an amateur level, and they really do not go through the educational process of developing the talent so that you could be exposed to them.
Going back from what you've studied, have you seen, was it the same case in the 60s and 70s where high school and college students were really into this? Is it the same pattern, or it's different now? I mean, younger people used to be into boxing.
Well, it all starts with money. Money is the director of everybody's future. And up until a number of years ago, the highest paid athlete in the world was always the heavyweight champion. Now you can go hit a baseball and get $250 million, right? You could go tackle somebody and be a linebacker and run a 4.4 40 and be 6'5", 237 and get, $20 million. So the question is if I'm an athlete, do I want to get punched in the face and try to get to that high level to be one of the highest paid athletes in the world? And a lot of them are going to say there's other opportunities. Baseball, basketball, football, hockey, they didn't exist like they did in the 60s. Boxing was the sport. And when you talk about marquee level sports. Do you think one of the problems is that before boxing used to be on network television, so anyone could pretty much see it? Now you have a few fights with Friday night fights on ESPN2. They have boxing nights on Friday nights on ESPN, but other than that, the marquee fights, you have to pay $50 for a pay-per-view thing, and most college students probably aren't going to want to pay that. Do you think that's a problem? Well, I mean, it is a problem to a certain extent, but there always was, years ago, even in the 60s, as big as it was Muhammad Ali or Ali and Frazier fighting as the fight from Madison Square Garden, it was closed circuit. So still that was that pay model that always existed in the sport. The problem is the exposure of that talent up to that point. Ali was always on network television. Most of the talent started in the Olympics, was exposed by network television in the Olympics. Boxing was one of the most watched events in the Olympics in prime time. You should watch Sugar Ray Leonard or Spinks or Howard Davis in '76 or Holyfield and Whitaker. And so people were exposed to them early on, and then the networks were putting them on every weekend. The networks aren't doing that now. The networks are looking at other sports, and right now the network models, a lot of it is time buys. So it's a totally different model.
So if the money was there, they would shift back to network television. It's just a function of the networks not being interested?
I think there's a function of a number of things, and I think one of them is there is some level of sponsorship support to the sport. Right now, all the sponsors are getting clubbed over the head when a network does a multi-billion-dollar deal with NFL, 18 to 49 demographic. So if you go to them and say, hey, we also have a boxing, program to show, the guy's like, I'm busted. I have tapped out. I got my football, I got NBA, I got how much more money am I going to have? So at the end of the day, they're going to go with the big brands. And those leagues, NFL, NBA, and Major League Baseball, are great brands. And right now we're seeing a shakeup in the NBA, but the brand is so strong.
Do you think that eventually those sports will start going to pay-per-view? Do you think people will start having to pay $40, $50 for the Super Bowl and people will go to... Do you see that, or do you think those major sports will always be on network television?
I think that there is an issue with those sports going to pay model. I don't see it happening. But I think by ESPN taking the NBA and NFL now taking 8 games and going to the NFL network, we're going to a smaller world now. It's, NFL wants to now look out for their own network. So I don't know if they have 35 million homes, or, they probably do. I think they're probably in 60 million homes, but it's a smaller universe. And the NFL network is now being created. And they're doing programming. NBA has NBA TV. So all these leagues now have their own networks, and now the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, are looking at different programming.
Another thing with a lot of these major sports, football, baseball, somewhat basketball, is there's this emergence of fantasy sports, which really attracts a lot of young people. They can essentially buy players from different teams and they compete, and if they eventually win, they can either win for pride or money or what have you. Boxing doesn't really seem to have a type of fantasy sports that can bring young people to attention. Do you see any movement to have a fantasy sports for boxing, or is it just not conducive to that?
Yeah, boxing is not as seasonal. When you deal with a season, you're able to have the fantasy. There are fights all over the world, 12 months a year. Boxing, unlike other sports, is a world sport. It's all over the world. If it's Australia, Thailand, Japan, Indonesia, to Germany, to Poland, to Hungary, to Russia, there are all talented fighters all over the world. The NBA doesn't have that proliferation. The NFL doesn't have that proliferation. So you're really dealing with a lot of different markets. And I think it would be very difficult to make a fantasy type of league. I think there's very creative people out there that can get on their computer and do some stuff that can make it conducive to that and maybe grab the young audience. But I don't think you could really apply the two models.
Now, another thing you touched on before was back in the 60s and 70s, people like Muhammad Ali would get a lot of attention, and people would either love him or hate him, and they would tune in for that. It doesn't seem that we're creating as much personality with the boxers now, that people aren't really, like you said, exposed as much and therefore aren't as interested. Whether you hate or love Bonds, people want to tune in to see if he breaks the record or what have you. Do you think that boxing needs to promote their fighters better?
I think boxing needs to promote boxing. I think the networks need to promote boxing, not just the talent. When you watch, if it's HBO or Showtime, which are predominantly the big networks for the pay level that do it, for them to promote only the superstars is delinquent. They should be promoting the entire sport. NBC or whoever has baseball, or they don't say, oh, we're only going to take Alex Rodriguez games and Barry Bonds games. They're taking the whole season. And I think what happens is there are great stories, there are great talents out there. A lot of people talked about how the Mayweather-De La Hoya fight, we had this 24/7 show, and everyone was like, this Mayweather's a character. I said, listen, I signed him in '96. I knew he was a character, But telling the story was the difficult thing. The stories were told yesteryear when they were in the Olympics. They're not being told now because there's no platform to tell them. And that's where there's a void. But there's plenty of stories, there's plenty of intrigue, there's plenty of talent, but the problem is there's no vehicle to expose that.
I know we were talking about this before off air. Do you think the fact that there aren't that many American boxers is an issue?
Yes and no, but I would go back to you with one other statement to you. How many Americans are there in Major League Baseball? That is becoming an incredible Latinized sport in itself. Same thing's happening with boxing. In the Latin American market, it's either soccer, boxing, and in parts of Latin America, baseball. That's it. Those are the big sports. So do I think we struggle a little bit from the fact that the American kids are growing up and they're looking to go into baseball or football or basketball? Absolutely. But we're seeing it in baseball and we're seeing it in other sports too, where you're getting a lot of the Latin influence.
Now, another